Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this IT governance webinar on cyber incident response management. And cyber incident response is a key part of compliance with the General Data Protection Regulation and with the Network and Information Security Directive, both of which came into force from May of this year. I'm Alan Calder. I'm the Chief Executive and founder of IT Governance, and I'm going to be your host for this afternoon. The webinar is intended to run for about 45 minutes or so, at the end of which there'll be time for me to answer any questions which you may have. If you do have questions, please use the question functionality in GoToWebinar. Sitting in the GoToWebinar control panel is a box called questions. If you click on that, it will enable you to type in your questions, and when we get to the Q&A session, I'll read out the questions, taking them from the top so everybody knows what the question is, and then I'll share with you the answer. Do feel free to put questions in there as they strike you as we go through the webinar. You will have seen that you're all on mute. That's the practical way for us to ensure that there is not too much background interference for people on the webinar. So as I said, I'm the founder of IT Governance. I set the business up about 12 or 15 years ago. We've grown fairly substantially from a business which existed originally to publish a book which, with Steve Watkins, I had written, plus several other books, and my backlist of titles has grown fairly substantially, but more importantly, IT Governance has grown into a global provider, single source provider of solutions for IT governance, cyber risk management, data protection, and general IT related compliance. The business, through the parent company which we set up, was floated or listed on the UK's AIM stock exchange in March of this year, and the business continues to grow very substantially across the broad range of areas in which we operate, from information security management through business continuity, data protection, and of course into incident response management. And our program today is to have a look at the GDPR's requirements in terms of incident response management and reporting, to have a look at the NIS regulations and their incident reporting requirements. There's quite a big crossover between the two sets of laws from a practical point of view, and then the importance of effective incident response management in the general data privacy, data protection, and cyber resilience aspects of an organization's compliance and risk management program, the link between incident reporting and incident response and the areas in which organizations can get themselves into greater trouble or lessen their challenges, and a brief incident of what a cyber incident response management program might look like and how to go about implementing something that will be effective inside an organization. Of course, the challenge for most organizations is accepting that cyber incident responses are going to happen, cyber incidents are going to happen. As an organization, while our broad area of activity is governance, risk management, and compliance, cyber resilience is a core of the activity. Cyber resilience in terms of data protection, cyber security, penetration testing, business continuity, PCI, all of them aspects of compliance and practical good behavior to deal with the reality that all organizations suffer cyber attacks, all organizations suffer cyber penetrations. The data suggests very strongly that even the largest organizations, which are very well protected in theory, will suffer something like 2 or 3 successful cyber attacks every single month. Much smaller organizations will suffer many more cyber incidents than that. In our data protection officer as a service business, we probably see the incidence of clients having cyber incidents running at about 1 in 3, and that's only since May the 25th, and that's reportable incidents as distinct from just cyber incidents. It's a brutal reality. Cyber incidents are going to happen. So the question doesn't become should we have a cyber incident response program, it becomes how do we put one in place and how do we do that effectively and quickly. And essentially, an incident response management process is a process for managing and responding to the unexpected and disruptive events in order to control them quickly enough to bring the impact that they'll have on the organization down to an acceptable level. But it's not just about controlling them, it's also about detecting, reacting and responding to the incidents. So you need to be able to put in place a mechanism for identifying that something has happened, to know how to escalate it, to know how to deal with it, and to do that all very quickly. If you look at some of the headlines that have emerged over the course of the last few years, take Carphone Dixon's, for instance, which, having admitted to a fairly major breach recently, the investigation of the breach led them to discover that actually there was a much deeper breach which took place approximately a year ago and which had been triggered by somebody clicking on probably an email which downloaded malware into their systems, and that breach led to a very substantial hundreds of thousands of data record compromise. So the failure to detect that for over a year, of course, doesn't work very well for an organization in telling its clients that it cares about its data. It's unlikely to work very well in terms of mitigating fines, even though the fine is more likely to be under the old Data Protection Act than under the new General Data Protection Regulation, simply because of the timing of when the actual breach took place. But the ability to identify that a breach has happened, systems which are monitoring at a deep enough level inside the business, and more importantly, staff across the business who are paying attention to what they do, so that even if they do make a mistake, and people make mistakes, they know how to report it and who to report it to quickly in such a way that the organization can respond quickly in a planned and coordinated way across the organization. You can think of resilience, the idea of resilience, as being a bit like the approach of a boxer in a fight. A boxer, when hit, doesn't want to go down onto the canvas and be out. They want to be able to cope with the punishment and hit back and keep going. So boxers develop resilience. They toughen themselves up. They develop the ability to sway and duck and to recover from what hits them, so that he or she can get up and keep going and last out the round. And managing cyber security has very much those kinds of characteristics. You have to be able to be tough enough to cope with the range of cyber attacks that are coming both internally and externally, even though many of the internal ones will be more accidental in nature than deliberate. You've got to be able to respond to them, you've got to be able to recover from them, you've got to enable the business to keep on going, because really customers are looking for continuity of service, not disruption, because you can't handle incidents. So a good cyber incident response program isn't going to prevent the inevitable from happening. It's going to prepare the organization to respond effectively and to minimize the impact of these things when they do happen. As I said, incidents can be a technical attack. They could be externally directed via either a deliberate or a general attack. Remember, something like 80% of attacks on organizations are automated, are delivered by attack software operating virtually autonomously on the internet, or being run by people who've downloaded easy-to-use attack software. Criminal activity aimed primarily at small and medium businesses, because they have less in the way of proper defense, and be able to break into a lot of organizations quickly and steal small amounts of money is sometimes quicker and easier than trying to break into one large organization. But you have technical attacks. Denial of service attacks might be mounted by competitors. Intrusions could be about stealing corporate data information, not simply records. And they can be the result of errors, the common data breach which comes about because somebody's misused the BCC entry line in an email, which means that somebody may have sent sensitive information out to 50 or 100 or 500 people who can now see who the other recipients of the information was. Those kinds of things are usually accidental, they're mistakes, but they're breaches. So an incident response process is about dealing with all of those things in a way that's effective. So technically then, system crashes, packet floods, unauthorized use of system privileges, unauthorized access to sensitive data, execution of malware that destroys files, internal destruction of systems, collapse of hard drives that haven't been backed up effectively. All of these are examples of adverse events that can happen inside an organization. They're all incidents. You should think of adverse events, cybersecurity incidents, all in the same heading. A denial of service attack, that could be mounted randomly. It tends to be more targeted. Typically, it's linked to some form of blackmail, as in we'll disrupt your business until you pay us an amount of money in bitcoins, but also it can be done simply to take a competitor offline. Environmental and physical disasters, those are going to create problems for you if you lose a server or you have a telecom system digging up the T1 line. That's going to take your whole organization out. The cloud systems that you rely on, cloud providers have outages as well as do ground-based data centers. Loss, theft, virus attack, theft of money can inconvenience an organization, make it difficult to provide ongoing services, website attacks, defacement and zero-day attacks. They're all versions of adverse events, incidents. As I said, if you treat adverse events and incidents, anything that can impact the organization's ability to operate digitally as being a cyber incident, then you've got a sensible approach. Many organizations still separate physical incidents, make those the preserve of the facilities management or building management team from digital incidents and make those the preserve of the security team. And the reality is that virtually all physical incidents, a fire in an organization, for instance, also has digital impacts. And so it makes a lot of sense for organizations to be thinking about business continuity, cyber incident response, and resilience as part of the same set of activities put under the management control of a single entity inside the organization. So sending emails to incorrect recipients, there have been a number of recent incidents where exactly that has happened. You can read about many of these kinds of incidents on the Information Commissioner's website. She and her staff publish details where there's been an adverse finding against the organization. In fact, there were some 1,700 voluntarily reported cybersecurity incidents involving only personal data to the Information Commissioner in June, quite a big jump on the 350 odd in May. Personal data sent to the wrong addressee in the post. Quite often you see local councils caught by this because they fail to keep records up to date. So somebody's moved house, but the information about social security or care in the community, whatever it is sent to a new person who now has access to sensitive information about somebody no longer living there. Newspapers are full of files or mobile phones left in public places, people walking into number 10 with files prominently showing information which can be captured by a zoom lens. They're all examples of people creating cybersecurity incidents or security incidents because they don't have adequate basic understanding of how to provide security. Suppliers can be a risk. Suppliers can be a risk under GDPR because as a data controller, it's your obligation to ensure that any supplier, any data processor you have is processing personal data in line with the contract you have with it. And if there is a breach in the supplier, then you, the controller of the organization, is primarily on the hook. Yes, you should be able to pursue the processor for their breach, but the ICO is going to go after the controller for the breach because it's the controller who selected the processor. So there's significant risk in the supply chain as well, and managing supplier risk in terms of their security will become an ever-increasing important part of how organizations deal with incidents. What does GDPR say? GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations, I'm sure most of you are aware, came into force in May of this year. There are a number of very specific requirements in GDPR which create obligations for organizations in terms of identifying and reporting data breaches. The definition of a data breach is very broad in GDPR. It says that a data breach is anything accidental or deliberate which involves the destruction, damage, alteration, loss, or unauthorized access to personal data. It can be loss of data. It can come about through an attack, but it's anything which corrupts effectively the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of data. And wherever data is concerned, occurs a data controller, that's not the data processor, the data controller has to report it to the information commissioner within 72 hours of becoming aware of it. That's if the breach is likely to cause a risk to the rights and freedoms of data subjects. If there's no risk, it doesn't have to be reported, and the grounds for determining that there's no risk really come down to simple things like, was the data encrypted? If it wasn't encrypted, you can assume that there probably is a risk to the data subjects. So you've got to report within 72 hours. That 72 hours starts from when you first become aware of it. So if it's something you discover on a Friday lunchtime, you're going to be reporting it to the ICO by lunchtime on Monday. No good trying to work out what your data response reporting activity looks like over the weekend. If you haven't already planned it, you're going to be struggling to meet the deadline, and failure to report within the deadline itself brings a potential fine. Of course, if the breach took place a year ago, you've got a bigger problem, which is how long it took you until now to get aware of it. When you claim that you've not been negligent in managing data, you're going to be struggling to demonstrate that failure to identify a breach a year ago proves that you haven't been negligent. So it's quite a big challenge for organizations, but the 72-hour element is really important. The data processor, when breached, has to report it to the controller with whom they've contracted in relation to that data. They have to report within 72 hours of first becoming aware of that, and putting the controller in a position where it can report to the information commissioner. If the breach isn't reportable, in other words, there is not a risk to the rights and freedoms of data subjects, the data controller still has to record the fact internally that there's been a breach, how it made the decision, what steps it's made to remediate that to ensure that it doesn't happen again. If there is a breach that has to be reported, well, the report has to, it's quite a long form that has to be filled in, and while you can fill it in on the ICO's website in stages, you want to provide as much of the data as you can as quickly as you can. Essentially, you've got to be talking about what actually happened, what type of data was breached, what type of, what categories, how many records, what type of individual data was compromised, how did it happen, what the likely consequences of the breach would be to the data subjects, and the more complete your incident report can be to the ICO, the more likely it is that you'll be managing their expectation of your negligence. The better your response to the data subjects will be, because you will have a more complete picture to formulate and focus your response. Where there is a high risk to the rights and freedoms of data subjects, then you've got to inform not only the information commissioner, but also the data subjects themselves. And the completeness of the information that you share with them is based on what do they need to know in order to take action to mitigate the adverse effects on themselves. You'd also be wanting to talk to data subjects either then or slightly later on about how you're trying to prevent this type of breach from happening again, but you might also need to be talking to them about things that you can do to mitigate the impact on them, and depending on the type of breach, that might run to providing them with credit monitoring and a number of similar services to help them deal with the consequences of a breach which was your fault, not theirs. To be able to report in that kind of detail within 72 hours means you need a number of staff inside the organization who understand what's involved in reporting. They at the very least need to know how to report. They need to know where the form is on the ICO's website. They need to be authorized to make the report. Remember that you're reporting a breach within the context of a law, so there are legal ramifications to any report that you might make, and that might mean that you want to have legal advice fairly quickly on in the process. You might not want to simply report as you're obliged to do. You might want to take legal advice about exactly how you handle that in order to minimize your own legal exposure. So you need staff aware of what your planned process is. You need to have the right documentation in place, and given the requirement that you document how you're responding to the breach, you need somebody at the very least who knows how to track what you're doing and document the various steps that you went through and to store that as part of your records. So it's quite a significant set of obligations to have around the simple business of identifying and reporting breaches. When you turn that into what does best practice look like? Well, best practice looks like an organization having measures in place that enable it to detect and respond to breaches. That's going to involve technical means, it's going to involve technical alerts, it's going to involve what happens on your firewall, it may involve information about people attempting to access applications they shouldn't be accessing. It's certainly going to involve people reporting where they think something's happened that the incident response team need to know about. You need to have an internal response team, because when you have an internal response team or incident response team, you've got somebody, you've got a group to whom an incident can be reported, and everybody inside the organization needs to know who reports should be made to. That's a key measure in your ability to detect and respond to incidents. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you need to have people who are working to a plan. You need to have sat down and thought through the range of scenarios that might occur, and some generic ones. You need to have a plan which identifies what type of data has to be gathered, what steps have to be taken to isolate perhaps the environment within which the breach occurred for future forensics. You might need to involve more responsible people. If there's a significant breach, the data protection officer might need to be involved. So all of that should be pre-planned, pre-thought, and able to go into action very quickly. Being able to respond quickly, of course, requires you need to know where data is being held. A data flow mapping exercise is a fundamental part of proper preparation for GDPR compliance and for proper preparation for incident response. If you're going to deal with a breach, being able to identify the fact that you've had a breach, but you can't really work out which records have been breached or which databases or by whom, creates a real problem. So a proper data flow mapping exercise, a data inventory is all a fundamental underlying part of your incident response infrastructure. Internal communication, critical. People need to know who to talk to. So your incident response team needs to have a communications matrix with the relevant contact information all readily available. That shouldn't be stored on a hard drive somewhere. The internal response team should have it easily available, perhaps in physical form as well as digital form, but they can easily identify telephone number, emails, everything that will enable them to get hold of the people that might be needed as part of the response plan. And of course, plans should be tested and audited. Tested to make sure they work, and there should be a third party, could be internal audit of the plan to make sure that it has been thorough and has been generally tested. You don't want, as the management team, to find out that when the incident response team says yes, they've tested the plan, what they really mean is they had a chat about it in the pub. You want to be able to audit and see evidence of the test, the lessons learned, and how those have been built into a future version of the plan. So that's best practice under GDPR. Let's turn now to the Network and Information Security Directive. The Network and Information Security Directive came into force at the beginning of May. It applies to two groups of organizations, what are called operators of essential services, OESs, and to DSPs or digital service providers. The requirements are very slightly different between each of those. So let me talk about both of them, but there's obviously, as you'll see, an overlap with the requirements of GDPR. The definition of an incident is not the same as the definition of a data breach. An incident under NIS is something and a significant impact on the continuity of the service. And that's because NIS is aimed primarily at critical national infrastructure and, as I said, at digital service providers, those entities whose ongoing 100% uptime is a critical component of the ongoing success and operations of large numbers of people or of the infrastructure of a country as a whole. Operators of essential services, which are defined in each of the 28 member states fundamentally by the regulatory authority in each of those states, but typically are national health or healthcare organizations, are likely to be utilities, are likely to be central government, may well be local government, all of the entities on whom large numbers of people depend. The requirement on OESs in terms of incident response is, first of all, that within 72 hours of discovering an incident, the incident is reported to what is determined to be the competent authority. In the United Kingdom, the competent authority is quite often going to be the ICO, but certainly where the incident affects is a cybersecurity incident, there's also a requirement to inform the National Cybersecurity Centre, the NCSC. The NCSC, which has got a privacy operations center, it's got a cybersecurity incident response team, will support the essential infrastructure operators and the authorities, the competent authorities, with cybersecurity advice and guidance. So recognizes that particularly highly technical attacks might not be things where the attacked entity has the capability to respond to it, but the National Cybersecurity Centre certainly does. So we're thinking here about often attacks being mounted by nation-state actors, by serious organized crime gangs, sometimes by highly competent hacker groups, but they're usually going to be focused on taking down a major entity. Sometimes, of course, we're dealing with organizations exploiting vulnerabilities which shouldn't be there. Think about the oft-cited WannaCry attacks and similar attacks through last year, which exploited known vulnerabilities in software which significant infrastructure organizations hadn't yet got round to dealing with in a way that would have enabled them to operate effectively. NIS requires that OES has put in place appropriate measures to identify, prevent, detect, and handle their reporting of incidents, have to have a proper process in place, must be able to identify weaknesses and vulnerabilities in the critical processes on which, as an entity, they depend, and they must document what they learn from incidents that occur. From their analysis of the incidents, they've got to document what they've learned, and that documentation has got to be available to be audited by competent authorities. Each competent authority will determine what level of incident is going to be reported to them, and for material contraventions, fines can go up to 20 million euros, or at current exchange rates, around about 17 million pounds sterling. And of course, that's up to, that means that fines can be significantly lower, but it's designed to operate at the same, and it could be 4% of turnover, it's designed to operate at the same kind of level of discouragement that are GDPR fines, trying to get organizations focusing on the direct financial penalty as well as the reputation loss that might come from the kind of breach that can happen for the operator of an essential service. Let's talk about digital service providers. A DSP is, for the purposes of NIS, typically an internet platform. It's not simply an e-commerce business. So the fact that you're operating an e-commerce business and you've got hundreds of, or thousands of customers dealing with you, that doesn't mean you immediately have to comply with the Network and Information Security Directive. It really is focused on organizations that where the disruption is likely to create a risk to public safety, to public security, could even potentially have loss of life, but would be looking at networks or information systems that affect, for instance, more than 100,000 users in the Union, or where services are unavailable for maybe, say, 5 million user hours. Those types of significant breaches. So if you're an internet service provider and you're supporting multiple utilities, for instance, and you go down, if you're a cloud service provider, if you're a major platform which supports multiple retail shops, those are the kinds of entities which are likely to be caught by the requirements of NIS in respect of digital service providers. And the requirements in terms of DSPs are very similar to those for OESs. Where feasible, you've got to report it to the competent authority within 72 hours of discovery. If it's a cybersecurity incident, you should also inform the National Cybersecurity Center. You've got to take appropriate measures to manage risks, which mean you've got to document how you do your risk assessment. You've got to document what measures you've taken and how you've enforced them and how you've tracked their application. You've got to take measures to prevent and minimize the impact of the incidents when it's occurring. And without undue delay, you've got to notify the ICO, who's the competent authority for DSPs, or the Computer Security Incident Response Team, where there is a substantial impact on service delivery. Obviously, if you think about the crossover in both of these cases with GDPR, if that breach involves a significant compromise of personal data, then you're making a report under two pieces of legislation, and it's entirely possible that you could get a fine under both pieces of legislation. There's nothing in the laws as passed which indicates that a breach under both of those will get you a fine under only one of them. They're two separate laws, so the potential impact where personal data is concerned can be substantially. The requirement is also to implement incident handling, business continuity management measures, business continuity planning. Standards like ISO 22301 tied with ISO 27001 now become a pretty standard way for organizations to think about demonstrating the application of best practice in terms of building incident response and business continuity inside the organization. And again, the requirement to document, provide evidence of the actions that you've taken to deal with an incident. So you see lots of crossover here with the requirements of the General Data Protection Regulation. So if you're a DSP or an OES, you should be thinking about how you meet your obligations at the same time as how you think about meeting your GDPR obligations. And it would make sense for you to create an integrated incident response team which is fully aware of the obligations you've got under both of those pieces of legislation, so that your incident response process is going to touch all of those requirements, and you're going to be able to demonstrate that you have behaved as you should in the context of those requirements. Incident response is important because obviously it's going to minimize the adverse effects of a breach. Obviously it'll guide the organization working out how it's going to respond to breaches and should limit damage to the organization and support from external stakeholders. I don't just mean shareholders, but I mean customers and suppliers. Should reduce recovery time and cost. If you know that your supplier of a critical service has got in place a really solid and robust incident response process which will deal with a broad range of possible adverse incidents and occurrences, you're much more likely to depend on them for significant areas of business than if you think they are very flaky in terms of how they will respond. Because you know that lack of plans when they're hit by an incident means that their response is going to be inadequate. They will be damaged. They will spend a lot of their time then with management diverted to deal with the repercussions of the event rather than focusing on providing to you the service which they should. And it's worth looking at some of the reality. Only 30% of organizations have an incident response plan. That's not based on rigorous external audit, that's based on organizations commenting on themselves. And because it's not a rigorous exercise, we would think that maybe half of those organizations genuinely have an incident response plan. And that ties with the number of organizations who have certification to a standard like ISO 27001. We're probably still in the less than 10% of organizations have certification, less than 20% of organizations currently compliant with the GDPR. It's almost certainly not the case that 30% of organizations have a robust and tested incident response plan. So small number of organizations genuinely have a proper incident response plan. And the average time it takes to detect a breach is 99 days. So most organizations, therefore, are in trouble under both NIS and GDPR because you've only got 72 hours to report a breach after you first become aware of it. And yes, you might say, well, we had the breach for 99 days. We didn't get aware of it for 99 days. As soon as we did, we reported it. You can bet that one of the first serious questions you're going to be asked is, how come it took you 99 days on average to detect this incident? What do you mean when you say you've got a proper information security process in place if it takes you 99 days to detect this incident? So the reality is that most organizations, even if they say they've got an incident response process in place, almost certainly don't have the front end of it, which is the ability to identify the breach as quickly as it happens. Following a breach, because the clock starts ticking the moment you've identified the breach, you're under severe pressure to deal simultaneously with a set of conflicting issues. You've got to deal with the breach, you've got to block it, you've got to close it down, you've got to stop it happening. You've also got to be documenting what you're doing, you've got to be working out how to meet your legal requirements, you've got to be thinking about what you tell your insurers, your cyber insurers. We already see evidence of organizations refusing to pay out under cybersecurity policies because they say the insured wasn't adequately protected. We'll see lots more of that in years to come. So you can't rely on a cyber insurance policy if you don't also have proper cyber security in place. It's a bit like trying to rely on your building security policy if you don't have proper building security in place. If you have somebody break into your house and steal valuables from the house and you left the windows open and the key in the lock when you went out, and somebody came in through the open window or through the open door and stole stuff, if you then lodge a claim, you're going to get rejected on the basis of your inadequate security. That same kind of argument is undoubtedly going to be made time and time again by cybersecurity providers. So clock starts ticking the moment you've discovered the breach. You've got 72 hours to come up with an incident response, which means you've got 72 hours to come up with a plan, work out how to do it, find people who know what they're talking about. All of that is kind of hard to do, which means that the faster you can put in place a proper cyber incident response plan, the better. And in thinking about cyber incident response, and before we look at some of the key challenges of how you do that, it's worth just touching on the phases of a cyber attack. And CREST, who is the membership body for penetration testers and incident response organizations, looks at a cyber attack as really having usually 3 distinct phases. The first phase is reconnaissance, the second is to attack, and the third is obviously to achieve the objectives of the attack. The reconnaissance phase is about looking for vulnerabilities in identified targets. You can manage that by having an awareness of the types of vulnerabilities you as an organization might have, by monitoring activity on your website, monitoring activity inside your network, looking for activity which is out of the ordinary, looking for fluctuations in web traffic which are out of the ordinary, collaborating with other people in the sector or across the business world to pick up early indicators of changes in attack. That would be a logical countermeasure to the kind of first phase attack reconnaissance that's going on. All of that should be part of your thinking about incident response management. The attack, which is about exploiting vulnerabilities and then defeating any internal controls to get to the assets of the organization. And most attacks aren't particularly focused on a given asset. Some of them are, but many of them are simply looking at what assets are available, and they will look for weak internal controls, they'll look for weak passports, they'll look to escalate privileges to get to the point where they can find some data that's worthwhile taking, they can exfiltrate and deal with. And you can deal with much of that in advance. You deal with that through how you design the system. So the IT architecture, the structure of your network, the internal and external structure are key components. You need to put that in place long before you breached, of course. Standard controls, ISO 27001 is a good example of standard information security controls ranging from access control all the way through to environmental controls and to staff awareness training around to network and communications controls. Very good management system, another way of dealing with the protecting of the assets effectively. And of course, penetration testing should be core to what any organization is doing. Ongoing regular penetration testing that is making sure that the controls you've got in place genuinely work as you want them to be working. And then the final phase is I've got into the system, I've found an asset, I want to exfiltrate this data, how do I get it out? And the types of countermeasures you should be looking at to deal with that that phase, obviously apart from simple things like if the data is encrypted, it doesn't matter whether they get to it or not because they can't do anything with it, but you certainly want to have incident response planning. You want to be able to escalate a cybersecurity incident up into your business continuity and disaster recovery planning. You want all of that to be part of an integrated, tightly managed set of activities. Good part of how you respond to countermeasures to the cyber attack. So the challenges, that kind of makes it sound easy. That's what we need to have in our cyber incident response process, but there are a number of challenges which time teaches, and we've worked with a number of clients to put in place incident response processes, and so we know both firsthand from long experience, from everything that goes on, that there are a number of challenges. Making your cyber incident response program really work, the first challenge is being able to identify that an incident has actually occurred. Most organizations don't have a proper definition of incident. They don't have the tools in place that enable them to properly identify that, and so they don't identify it. They don't identify it until often they've been told that a whole lot of information has been stolen. They miss the incident occurring. Carrying out an investigation is difficult to do unless you know what the objective of the investigation is. You need to know what you're trying to clean up. You need to know what are you trying to find out. And typically the objective of the investigation should be what data has been stolen, how was it accessed, what controls were missing. That should lead you to work out what type of controls you do put in place. And of course, what data was stolen should lead you to be able to think about what remediation can we take in respect of that data right now. The third challenge is analyzing the information related to the potential cybersecurity incident. You don't always have all the facts that you need to have to determine what action you need to take now. It's quite possible that you only get data in phases or in partial amounts, and you have to respond very quickly on the basis of partial information. You've got some information about how an attacker got into the system, some information about what data was compromised. You're making decisions quite quickly, so you need to allow for the fact that you need to review the data you collected right through the incident response process so you can make some practical decisions about how you improve what you did. And of course, that determining what actually happened, in a sense, is one of the core challenges. What did happen? How did this person send out this information? How come she put 500 email addresses in the carbon copy bit of the email, and this was an email saying, I just want to tell you all about how we deal with your latest cancer discovery, and suddenly you've shared some very sensitive personal information with 500 people. How did that happen? Was it through error? Was it just confusion? How did that happen? If you can't work out what actually happened, who got it, who saw it, it's difficult for you to work out how to counter it. Depending on the nature of the breach, what systems, networks, and information assets have been compromised, what's been disclosed to people who shouldn't have had it, who did it, why, how, what the potential business impact of the incident is, and then what's an adequate investigation? When do we know we've done enough to determine what happened, how it happened, and what action we should be taking to deal with it? So the reality is most organizations just do not understand how ready you have to be to respond to an incident. They don't understand the extent to which your incident response team needs to be on alert the whole time. It's no good just having somebody who answers the telephone if it happens to ring and then goes, now what do I do? They need to be on high alert because incidents happen at any time. They involve people, process, and technology. They're usually quite complex incidents, and therefore, particularly with major incidents, you require professional expertise to be able to respond to them. At the very least, you need a professionally put together incident response plan. There is an international standard which deals with incident response. It's ISO IEC 27035, and it says there are 5 stages that there should be for any incident response management process. The first is the plan and prepare stage. Create policies, plans, make sure you have top management commitment to the whole idea of incident response, make sure you have a proper team, everybody's properly trained. Detect and report the incident, have the measures in place, the mechanisms, the tools in place that will enable you to detect an incident, that train people to report, know where to report it to, gather the information, know then as a third stage how to assess the incident, determine whether it's a minor incident, it's a major incident, does it need to be escalated, what steps do we need to take to deal with the incident. Having made a decision, you need to respond, and the response will typically involve containing the breach, then eradicating the cause of it, recovering properly, having contained it, resolving the vulnerabilities that led to it happening, and then closing the event down completely as having been properly dealt with. And the fifth stage is, what did we learn from this incident and from how well the process operated, and how do we build that back into making the process work better next time round? So every breach that happens, the resilient organization should learn one or more things from it that enables it to cope better the next time round. So the 5 stages from ISO 27035, you can compare that with the 7 steps that CREST says your incident response management process should have, and you'll see that there is a fairly logical overlap, except that CREST doesn't put so much time and effort into the preparing part. CREST deals with incident response management on the basis that you have already prepared to deal with it, and it puts aside ISO 27035's last step, which is the lessons learned phase. So so CREST says start with detecting it, report it internally, investigate it, and then do triage. So it's dealing with the detect and respond phase from ISO 27035. Triage means you're reporting it to a team of people who know how to assess an incident, determine the scale of the incident, the seriousness of it, and determine what to do. And then phase 5 is doing what is necessary, containing the attack, putting in place recovery steps that enable the organization to get itself back up and operating, deal with all the ramifications, and then the 7th stage is the follow-up, making sure that all aspects of the incident are properly closed down, vulnerabilities are properly contained, and you're able to treat the incident as being closed. So you can think of CREST 7-step responses sitting inside the 5 stages that ISO 27035 talks about, and it's that combination of both of the frameworks which gives you a practical approach to incident response planning. Any incident response planning exercise, and it is a big exercise, frankly, to put in place an incident response management program, because you've got to contextualize it. You've got to start off by saying, what is it that we're trying to do? So typically, if you're working with one of our consultants, say, you'd be looking at what's the overall context, who is the organization here, what's in scope, what's the attack surface that we're dealing with, what's the range of issues that we might have to respond to from an organizational point of view? What's the scope of the plan going to be? If there are 7 companies in the group, are they all involved? Are we only looking at one major company? But that's the first thing, the overview. And what are the objectives? The objectives simply reputation management, or is it reputation management and helping clients respond quickly? What's our overall objective in terms of how we deal with responses? What's the basis on which we're going to judge risks? How does this tie into our overall corporate risk management strategy? The next step is to identify what business assets are at risk. And that's going to look both at systems and at data. It's also got to recognize that when looking at data, you've got to be thinking about personal information, both from the perspective of the impact on the organization if personal data is compromised, but also the impact on individuals. So you can find yourself with 2 approaches to risk acceptance, one which might be low or medium in relation to impacts on the organization, but could be simultaneously medium or high in terms of your understanding of the impact on the individuals concerned. But critical assets, you're looking at the impact on the organization, what threats and vulnerabilities could lead to what kinds of impacts, what the likelihoods of that might be, what the maximum tolerable downtime is for any given system, how long can you cope if a system is down, and therefore how quickly do you have to restore it? Who are the critical assets are all key parts of this thinking. The next part of your planning is, what's the reporting process going to look like? what have we got documented? How are we going to document it? How are we going to train staff? How are we going to teach them how to escalate an incident in a way that enables it to be reported to people who can make the right decisions quickly enough? So if you have a help desk and you've got thousands of people reporting incidents on a daily or hourly basis into a help desk, what do you tell them to do in terms of what they think of as might be a cybersecurity incident? You should probably tell everything gets reported to the help desk, and you train your help desk analysts to be able to identify things that are possible cybersecurity or continuity incidents. They escalate them to a cybersecurity incident response triage team, who then can make the decisions about what should be done. So once you've got the context right, you can begin thinking about how do we take the generic 7-step procedure that CREST puts in place, and how do we create a number of step-by-step scenarios where we know how to execute those steps in respect of a given attack. So you could say, for instance, yourself, what happens if there is a denial of service attack on our main website? What's our maximum tolerable downtime? That would lead you to game a series of scenarios under which you work out what you would do if that incident were to happen. You could do the same with an attack on the data held in a major SQL Server database that supports a key part of your client systems. If we lose that system, how long can we go without it? How do we get it back on stage? What are the steps we might go through? And you can, as I said, game those with 2 or 3 people in the incident response plan team, with several people from outside of it who might say, yes, but what happens if X, or what happens if Y? And you can document all of those. You've got a plan, you can rehearse it, and then when it happens, if you find the plan isn't quite adequate, you've at least got a starting point from which you can learn. You can improve your ability to handle things next time. The overall incident response plan should be signed off by somebody on the board. You want there to be proper accountability with a designated owner of the plan. You want the plan updated in line with changes to the business, to infrastructure, critical services, and so on, so that it's always current. Most organizations, when they go through a phase of saying, let's get our business continuity or incident response plan up to date, we'll get it all up to date, and 2 years later, it will still be up to date for 2 years ago. And actually, a key part of what you're doing is making sure it continues to be updated on an ongoing basis. You need to have enthusiasm around business continuity and incident response planning baked into the business as usual approach of the organization. And that should be reflected really in your documentation. So you should have an incident response team set of documents which have got incident response team contacts, internal and external, a checklist of actions, a log to capture evidence of how you're dealing with the incident, pre-prepared incident response communication, as you might train senior members of the management team on how to deal with press or television or social media commentary on an incident. You might have conference facilities put available. You'd certainly want to have business continuity and other documentation easily available, not in an environment which might be compromised by the incident itself. There are a number of places that you can go to get information. The SANS website is a good resource for checklists and forms. Information security is a key part of business continuity planning. If you look at ISO 22301, you will see that it talks about incident response, and it talks about information security, and 27001 as how to deal with that. And of course, as I said, running across all of this, given that most cybersecurity incidents also involve personal data, general data protection regulation reporting, and the possibility that the incident might have to be dealt with in a way that complies with the requirements of GDPR should be a key part of how you think about what you're doing. So from an IT governance point of view, there's a number of ways we can help organizations tackling this critical part of cyber resilience. You can buy copies of the standards off of our websites. You can go on an Incident Response Management Foundation training course. It's a new training course which brings with it a certificate, an IRM certificate. You can draw on us for consultancy support. There are books. There's a toolkit of documentation that you can use. We can do cyber health check, which is a short check of cyber health, which would look at everything from risk assessment and governance all the way through to the type of controls that you have in place. Would look a bit at the way in which penetration testing informs what you do. Would do a brief survey of staff approach to information security, give you a good all-round snapshot of the level of cybersecurity inside the organization. So a number of things in the broader GDPR, data protection, privacy, and regulatory range of products and services that IT governance one-stop shops can offer, specifically focused on cyber resilience. And of course, you can identify a number of other resources through our website, social media, and an ongoing series of webinars which we run on this and on other subjects where you can access information on a complementary basis to use inside your own endeavors to build a cyber resilient organization. And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings me to the end of what I was planning to say today. So that brings us to the point where we can deal with any questions that you may have. So just to reiterate, if you have any questions, and I'm perfectly happy if you do or you don't, the way to deal with it is in the Q&A, in the question section in your GoTo webinar panel. If you've got any questions, please do type them into the question box, and I'll pick them up and I'll read out the questions and answer them. And so one question is it a legal requirement to have an incident response process? The answer to that is it's a legal requirement that you're able to respond to incidents and report breaches, and that therefore translates, yes, into effectively it's a legal requirement. But the absence of an incident response process on its own is not breaking the law. The absence of reporting properly within time and doing the job properly is where the breach happens. So you need to have an incident response process which is going to enable you to meet those compliance requirements. What happens if there is a breach which takes place on a Saturday and you don't find out until the Monday? Well, yes, this happens quite a lot, and the answer to that is that if you only find it on the Monday, you've got 72 hours from when you first discovered it, but you're likely, as I said before, to find yourself explaining why you couldn't discover it on a Saturday, particularly if the information that's compromised is valuable, and the data subjects who are affected by it will be significantly worse hit than if you had had a better form of incident response in place. And that looks like all there is in the way of questions, ladies and gentlemen, and that's kind of neat because we're pretty well at the end of our time. So I hope you found that webinar on cyber incident response management helpful. Please do, if we can help you, get in touch with us, and across any of the areas in which we provide products and services, we'll happily deal with helping you become more cyber resilient. I hope you all have a very good weekend. Thank you and bye-bye.